So I guess let's go back to the unintended consequences, because one thing, whenever I look at the impacts of any government action, there's always things that you can't predict, and there's always unintended consequences. So what are some other good examples of the unintended consequences of rent control, both bad and good?
Sure. So, I mean, there's lots of studies that talk about how it's, negatively impacted the supply of rental housing. Because at the end of the day, there are different ways that you can make money. So, I think we probably want to get that one on the table, quickly, because I think it's one that most people can see and understand right away. So when someone is going to invest $1, right, or $1 million or $1 billion, whatever the number happens to be, they have choices to make. They have choice as to whether they're going to invest in rental housing. They're going to maybe in, just regular single family homes, condominiums, commercial buildings, Tesla, GE, bond market, etc. So that's one of the set of choices that they have. The other is jurisdiction. So if you are going to invest your money and you believe that rent control is going to reduce your ability to get a decent return, which I'm going to contend might actually be a false assumption, but it's if you believe that that's the case, then your money will want to flow to a more investor-friendly jurisdiction. And that's always the fine line between the levels of rent controls. The more severe the rent control, the more likely the capital is to move to other things. So right now we have a situation where if you take a look at the internal rate of return, an IRR to use a financial basis, if you take a look over a similar period of time, so which by definition the way an IRR should be used, but 3 years, 5 years, so let's say 5 years. If you were to put money into a rental housing project versus a condominium project, the IRR is going to be better on the condominium project. And what that means is that the return comes in faster, effectively, for the investor. Plus, they don't have to put as much capital up front, right? Because you pre-sell condos typically, so you get a lot of your working capital right up front. Whereas in rental housing, you don't end up with that working capital up front. So you end up with a shift towards other forms of investment other than purpose-built rental housing. So, and while the individual investors gave us some relief on that side, it is still a fundamental issue, and it fundamentally puts downward pressure on the supply of rental housing, creating low vacancy rates, which we've seen in every rent control jurisdiction. And that's where a lot of that stress comes from. If we can, get over, and the Cambridge study was kind of an interesting one, because in the Cambridge one, they actually took rent controls off. This was back in the early 90s. And everything kind of opened up and the quality of housing improved. The one problem with the Cambridge study is that if anybody's ever been to Cambridge, they'll realize that it's kind of limited in terms of where it can actually grow. So adding more rental housing in Cambridge itself was, problematic. So it was kind of an incomplete study in that respect. Mm-hmm. So unintended consequence is low vacancy rates as a result, because of the lack of supply, and this has been shown everywhere. Now let's talk about another one. So this is one that I think will have impacted a number of jurisdictions this year. So I'm going to give you Ontario as an example, right? Because it's one I'm very familiar with. So in Ontario, typically what happens is the rents for the next year are calculated by the province's average CPI for the preceding year. It's June to May of the preceding year. And they calculate that and they say, okay, for then the next year that's what the rent, control limit is going to actually be. And that seems reasonable because, as I said earlier, most people's pensions or forms of assistance are typically indexed by CPI. The problem that happened this year is, and in fact, it was actually introduced back about 9 years ago. there was a legislation because there was an uproar at the time when rents were going up by about 3.3%, and the tenants rebelled and the government panicked because they were always on the edge of losing an election. And so they immediately just said, that's fine. From now on, we're going to fix it and make sure there's no more than an increase of no more than 2.5%, regardless of what CPI is. And for most of that time, it didn't matter because CPI was below 2.5%. Right. And so it was a bit of a wash until this year, where we all saw inflation hitting about 7%. And then what happened was, oh, yeah, but rents are capped at 2.5%. So here's an unintended consequence of that. This is something where if you are making a decision about a renter, and I don't advocate this position, I want to be very clear. I very much believe in the human rights code, et cetera, right? And so but one of the things that happens is you've got 10 people to choose from because it's a low vacancy market. So 10 people to choose from. Some of these people are on fixed income, right? And they're likely to be long-term renters. Think of the elderly, think of people on social assistance. They're typically not going to want to move, and they're going to want to enjoy the benefits of rent control, which is fine and legitimate. That's the legislation we work with. But if you've got 10 candidates to choose from, you're probably going to focus on the people that are going to move more often, because you get to benefit from the turnover at that particular time. And then if you add the fact that 2.5% is an absolute cap, and you're assuming that inflation could be higher than this, in the foreseeable future, then you realize that you're at a significant disadvantage by choosing someone that is going to be a long-term renter. So that's another, example of unintended consequences, and it really hurts the most vulnerable in our society.
Yeah, which is what the legislation was brought into place to actually do in the first place.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for watching. To watch the full episode, click right here. And to watch another great clip, click right here. And let me know what you think. Leave a comment, hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And until next time, happy investing.